Now, before we begin, I just want to say big thanks to a few people. First, thanks so much to SF Environment for hosting us at their beautiful space, and to Rachel and Becky Spey for supporting the panel. Also, big, huge thanks to Julia for organizing this panel and for her support of this program during her time as community organizer at the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition. She's moving on to the next chapter of her life in Philly, and she will be so missed. So thank you, Julia. Oh no. Huge thanks to Anna Gore, who was just here. She is also moving on to the next chapter of her life. She's moving on Monday to Portland. And she co-founded the Women Bike SF program. And she's created so much community because of it. And I'll start crying again if I keep going. But yeah, she's going to be so missed. So if you see her, please give her a huge thank you and goodbye. Let's see. Last but not least, big thanks to our moderator, Katie Steyer. Katie has been active in the biking community for over a decade. She also co-directs Oakland Community Radio Station, KGPC LP 96.9 FM, and hosts Oakland Bikes, a radio show on race, gender, class, and bicycles in the Bay Area. We're so excited and grateful that Katie is moderating this panel. Without further ado, I'll hand it off to Katie now.
Thanks everyone for being here. It's wonderful to see all of your beautiful faces this evening. So tonight's panel, Intersectional Feminism and Biking. As Kelsey just announced, part of San Francisco Bike Coalition's Women Bike Programming. So before we get started, I would like to address an issue that was raised in the run-up to this event, and I believe it integral to our conversation tonight that we'll have. Intersectional feminism, as put forth by the Combahee River Collective Statement and distilled by Kimberly Crenshaw, is the academic treatment of the lived reality of Black women. That Black women suffer unique interlocking oppression due to their race, gender, and class. It was brought to our attention by one of our panelists that, and our as SFBC and myself, that this panel is too light-skinned to be truly intersectional. We recognize this, and we apologize for recreating the silencing and oppression of darker-skinned Black women in this way. So, just opening that. So I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists here. First we have Binky Brown, who is the founder and owner of Hard Knocks Bikes, a specialty bike shop offering hands-on workshops for the not-so-average rider, services and resources for support all of those who identify as women, people of color, trans, and all other gender rebels and allies throughout the East Bay. Binky Brown. I would next like to introduce Brittany Brown, recently, but no longer, a community planner with Transform. Brittany's now taken a position with OCDOT, Oakland Department of Transportation. Brittany grew up in East Oakland. Her work spans such orgs as, South Berkeley. That was wrong. South Berkeley, correction. And we'll be doing that. There will be times when we will get to say, actually, no. So get used to that. So Brittany grew up in South Berkeley, thank you. And her work spans orgs such as East Oakland Building Healthy Communities, MTC Bike Share Equity Outreach Initiative, and a lot more. Knows a lot. Done a lot of good work. So everyone, welcome Brittany. Thank you very much. Next we have Emily Thecia Marchena Lopez, a core organizing member of Bicis del Pueblo, a project of Poder, and a founding member of the Nothing Nice Collective, a grassroots organization that holds space and empowers the QTPOC community in the Bay Area. Emily Thecia commutes by bike and races locally. Next, I would like to introduce Jane Natoli, a board member of the SFLGBT Center, whose mission is to connect people to opportunities, resources, and each other to achieve a vision of a stronger, healthier, and more equitable world for LGBT people and allies. Thank you very much, Jane, for being here. Everyone, welcome Jane. And last but not least, I have Jen Chan online. Jen does community outreach at Livable Streets Division of the SFMTA, Municipal Transportation Agency. She also organizes the Supermarket Street Sweep, an annual race to benefit the SF Marin Food Bank and also races locally. Everyone, please give a warm round of applause for Jen and all of us to come here tonight and have this conversation, invaluable conversation, and I'm really excited. So let's just get started. So, in the context of current national and state politics, excluding California because we are slightly more progressive, how do we push for local transportation planning that centers environmental and racial justice? And I want to ask Brittany this question. How do we make sure on the ground needs of grandmothers and young girls are being met? You know, that.
Okay.
But use that mic.
Oh, okay. Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, sure. So it's like in the context of like everything that's going on with like Trump and like we see other states with legislation that is, you know, anti-women, anti-people of color. In California, how do we help our communities and how do we push for local transportation planning that centers environmental and racial justice? Like, how do we keep young girls and grandmas on the streets on bikes, you know?
Okay. I don't know if this is on. Is it on?
Oh, you're on. You're on.
So I love to reference people because I'm a researcher at heart, and I love Sarah Suleiman. She writes for Streets Blog LA, and when after the election happened and we got who we got, I read Sarah's blog, and she was basically talking about how, you know, for a lot of Black folks, and that context is, you know, South LA, nothing really has changed in terms of, you know, just in terms of the administration. Like, African Americans, our situation really hasn't changed, and I think that's something that folks need to kind of recognize as it's their first time experiencing marginalization and feeling like they're oppressed. It's very triggering to get that. So I was getting that a lot, and maybe we can, like, I hope other folks can chime in, but like right after election, people are like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And I'm like, hey, what's up? Welcome. This is a thing. This is a thing. So I guess just kind of I'll just kind of like frame it that way. Like, these things have been happening, oppression and marginalization has been happening, and so when we think about transportation, we think about biking, how do we kind of center the needs of folks from the very beginning? Like, what were your concerns 2-3 years ago, 50 years ago? My context is Oakland. I live in Oakland. I'm from South Berkeley, but I grew up in the East Bay, so all throughout the East Bay. And I work for the Department of Transportation, and I'm looking at plans from 2007. Like, I want to know what people wanted in East Oakland in 2007, because nothing really has changed. Bancroft still looks the same. International Boulevard still looks the same outside of, you know, our bus rapid transit that we're getting. So kind of just recognizing that, like, there's always been that context, like that, going back and looking at history and recognizing the needs of communities. So centering things like transit first, and making it and thinking, and I'm just gonna get kind of technical into the weeds, but like really planning streets for interested but concerned riders. That's who I want to plan streets for, people who are very interested and want to bike, maybe recreationally to start, because that feels safe and that feels good and that's enjoyable for them. So I want to plan the streets for them, and that's what I'm kind of saying, like, let's start there, let's center transit, and let's make it, let's start with recreational, and then we'll go into the, into the commute and all that stuff. So hope that gets at it, and I hope other folks want to like chime in, because that's a heavy question.
Thanks again, Katie, for having us. And I first want to acknowledge that we're on Native land, right? There's also no Native people to this land on this panel as well. So when we talk about intersectional feminism, we also talk about Native struggles too, right? I think chiming into this question and what Brittany is saying, I think it's really most important to also talk about how are we engaging with community, right? That we're not just planning for community, because that's not how it works. We're never going to get to the change that we need, right? That we're planning with community, right? And we're intentionally building with community. If you look around the room, honestly, I don't feel like this room necessarily represents intersectional feminism, right? How do we make this accessible to the people who are the most marginalized? How do we create those dialogues and talk to those people? Not tokenize them, right? Not just have your little quarterly meeting with them or, your surveys, like intentional community building, right? Because one, that's where the healing is going to begin, right? And two, that's where the change is going to come from, right? And that we're constantly engaging and building, that, you're doing the on-the-ground outreach, and it takes a lot of labor. I've been doing community organizing in the past 5 years, and it's a lot of emotional labor too, right? But that's because you're connecting with people, right? You're getting to know each other's struggles, you're connecting with their hearts, and that's where you're going to find, like, what are the needs, right? How do you work with these people, right? How do we step away from our computer and how we go walk over to Mission, instead of Valencia, Mission, and we talk to la gente that are there, right?
Yeah. And so to follow up on that, how do we as community organizers in the bicycling community reach out and talk about these pains and oppressions, but also take care of ourselves and not be like pimping out our pain for dollars and for like grant funding organizations? And like, if the word pimping out or the phrase is triggering to people, I'm sorry, but it sometimes feels that pain is drug out repeatedly just to get your like yearly funding check. Like, can you speak to that, or does anyone else want to speak to that and sort of like wrestle with that one?
What Brittany was saying was like, hi, we've been dealing with this for like 500 years now, so it's not gonna stop until we just completely destroy white supremacy, capitalism, heteronormativity, And so I was like, wait, hold on, like I can't stop feeling the pain and the trauma that I'm feeling, right? I can work towards healing, so it's like, that's a really difficult thing, right? So I'm walking around constantly, right?
Yeah. I feel like it's the same, like there really isn't a good answer. Like, I think just thinking about it, talking about it is really what's going to help start moving that answer forwards, or multiple answers, because there's not just one. But yeah, it's like I'm not sure exactly what it would take, but at least trying to be as open, understanding, as intersectional, trying to get involved, not just, like you said, just using people's pain. But just even off my head thinking about grants, I'm like, really, there isn't. Like, you need all these painful statistics that you need to know.
Right.
And, just to prove that you deserve money to somehow come out of those statistics, it's kind of strange. So, yeah, I don't know if anybody else has a good answer for that.
So, how do you then gain the trust and convince your community of color to buy into transportation planning infrastructure amidst valid fears of displacement and gentrification? Like, that's real. And the perception that bike lanes are white lanes. And I take that from a book that was recently published, sort of looking at this idea of bicycling infrastructure on the ground as being placed for the use of white folks and folks of privilege. I'm wondering if you can speak to that, or if you have anything to add to that.
Some, just as in Yeah, it is kind of the problem of like the people that have the money to make the plans are the ones that make the plans, and they're kind of just, you know, bowling through a lot of things. And even where I presently live, it was like, wow, gentrification just like landed on top of us with excellent bike lanes, you know. And so you know, it's kind of frustrating because the two shouldn't have to go together. And I think, yeah, I mean, it was really like you're saying, like just going in, talking to people on a regular basis, making a connection with them, because there's a lot of things that like people don't understand. Some things people do when they ride, when they're not in like the cycling community, but have been riding for years and years and years, is everyone does something that they feel is safe. You know, even though it might not actually be legal by the law, they're doing it because they think it's the safest thing for them to do. You know, and kind of taking that understanding, I think, into planning really makes a difference. Like, I mean, nothing for, but like, I mean, really, one thing that if I was on a planning commission, and I know it takes a lot of things, but it's just like, to be able to make bike lanes that maybe aren't on the main streets, I think would help a lot, and kind of taking that, like, you don't have to put the bike lanes where the cars are, you know, and I recognize there's only so much space and there's certain streets that there's no parallels. But I mean, I think just taking, you know, the people that live there, and I know some people, you don't want bikes in front of their houses, but they're never going to be as dangerous as a car going past your house.
Yeah.
So I just think, like, you know, actually, like I said, just getting in, talking to people, why do you ride backwards? Oh, it feels safer. Maybe we can make 2 lanes that you can go on your bike on 2 lanes, and that will make you feel safer. You know, and so but I think that is it, just really going and talking to people that have been there for years and years, and just, you know, like, why is this what you feel? And, you know, like I said, I mean, anyone that rides on the sidewalk is because the street does not feel safe. And there are some streets I completely understand, you know, and it's like, I'm like, I hope nothing happens. But at the same time, you know, you know, and then there's the things too of like, I mean, just kind of like on the real concept of like when you ride on the more common streets too, like you're more likely to get pulled over if you are a person of color, you know, like it's another reason to avoid the bike lanes too, because, you know, they'll really pull you over for anything if they're trying to meet quotas, you know, right. So, exactly. You know, it's, you know, and just taking that into consideration, like there was something that I had read, and it was talking about something that had happened with the Oakland Police Department, because I live in Oakland too, it was trying to make them not pull over cars for minor things, they were hoping, and it would be like, if they could do something similar with bikes, like if you didn't almost hit somebody with your bike, you know, you don't need like to get, you know, that city doesn't need your revenue that way. And I think like just trying to instill different laws and different understanding and talking to people, I think would just, I mean, I think that would just really be at least part of one solution.
Right. No, that was great. I'm wondering, so when we think about laws and transportation planning, and we're at our desks, when our expertise as women of color, and Jen, I'd like to ask you this question, is disregarded by senior staff when considering stakeholders or community organizing actions, like how do you deal with that? And how do you hold accountable your senior staff members and your bosses, right? When they're trying to tell you like, well, I've got this great education and this great degree, so I know, and then you say, well, actually, I've got this life experience, so here's what I have to say. Like, how do you have that conversation in the midst of that?
So, unfortunately, I'm pretty new to NTA. I started a few months ago, but I think representation is important, and we're fortunate enough in our local streets team to have a pretty diverse group of planners and engineers, and of course we can always still do better in that regard too, but I feel like especially now in this current climate, we've been having more and more conversations about how we can be more inclusive with our outreach and capacity building. I think that's a big thing in doing outreach. I mean, planning itself could be very exclusionary even with our terms. It can be very intimidating for people to just show up to a community meeting and look at these planning boards and have no idea what it's really talking about. And so I think having a fresh set of eyes with our personal experience as women of color or anything else that we can bring to the table, because it can be easy to become blind to what someone else's experience and perception can be. And so there hasn't been any pushback. I think it's a good time and a good place to be in transportation planning, at least at the MTA, to be having these conversations, as I feel like management is now more open to criticism. I feel like through backlash on various projects going back years, there are a lot of lessons to be learned, and there are a lot of difficult conversations to have. I know there are times, even how we advertise meetings, that having a sleek poster with a big graphic can make sense to a transportation planner who's used to seeing these things. But for, say, I don't know, if my grandma were to see it and it says, call this for translation, if it's just a photo, there's nothing to translate.
Right.
And so,
But it's like a meeting for like her street and something that she would benefit from
exactly.
greatly.
So I think capacity building is a big thing, as well as making sure that we're not just having people come to the room to have the conversation, but getting them into the room.
Yeah.
And being mindful that a lot of people work multiple jobs or need to find childcare or not having public meetings in a police station. All of these things are important things to think about and elevate to management if there were ever a misunderstanding or a gap there.
Yeah.
And I think what you touched upon of representation is everything. Representation is key. That is what we are here talking about tonight. And I want to ask Jane this question. Oftentimes we promote women's cycle-centric events as WTF. We do it all the time, right? We promote these as WTF inclusive spaces, and oftentimes they are events mostly attended by white, cisgendered, heterosexual women. This may be a friendly space for, QTPOC folks, but you hear about it feeling uncomfortable, right? And unwelcoming. And so I'm wondering, what are indicators or flags that a space is probably WTF washing their event? And how can we help other women of color, queer, trans, people of color, folks to recognize that? Or if someone finds themselves in that space, like, what advice would you give them to navigate that?
Another softball. So obviously I can only come at this from an incomplete experience, right? I'm still a white person stepping into this space. I still experience a ton of privilege in that regard. And it's still really uncomfortable for me as a trans person. You never really know. I think the challenge is it's so easy these days to just be like, we're going to make this way. We're going to put whatever phrase is currently, in 2 years it'll be something else, right? But like whatever is currently in that we're trying to say, yes, we are with it. But are you really doing the work? I mean, when I go into these spaces, like, especially if they actually really are centered on queer and trans folks of color, like, I should be doing most of the listening. Really, what do I have to say? I think that's always a sign when I see some of these things. If you see something that's advertised this way or promoted this way, there's the challenge of tokenization, right? You don't want to just be like, oh, look, well, we found our one person to meet this. But at the same time, like, if people don't see that at all, then that's definitely not a good sign. It's a really difficult question to answer. You have to truly ask yourself, like, what kind of space am I creating? And ask yourself a hard question after you look around a room, after you look around an event, like, what could we have done better?
Right.
And that's work that I think those organizers of those spaces that aren't as friendly need to do before the people of color are even there, or the trans and queer folks that don't feel like they really need to be asking that. They need to be doing that work and actually trying to address those steps, because simply realizing, again, to kind of go back to a point like venue, like where you're doing something might not be inclusive. The time you're doing it, how you're doing outreach. There are a number of reasons you may not be reaching these people that you can't just go to your one friend and be like, I'm going to lean on you and get the answers from you.
Yeah.
You got to do the work.
Right.
And I think you can tell when you go into a space that has done it, that it's constant. you cannot stop doing it. You can't be like, well, we did it well this month. What can we learn from it? What can we do better? And that's a question you always have to be asking yourself, and really listening, really trying to hear what people are telling you. Otherwise, it doesn't matter.
Do anyone else want to follow up to that?
I mean, I 100% agree, and I think that it is like you're saying, like analyzing it kind of beforehand and then after, and then just making sure that you're that you're doing it and reaching out in different ways. Like I don't think I could have said. I like that answer because it is really about thinking about what you're doing and then checking in, because it was just, especially when you're like, you know, you can tell because it's constant, and I was like that's really where it's at, I think.
So I just want to say that WTF isn't necessarily inclusive either for QTPOC, right? It's not inclusive. I've yet to come across a WTF space that has been really inclusive, actually, you know, aside from like being like, oh, cool, I'm the only woman of color right here, right now, you know, without feeling tokenization, right? Or without feeling some sort of unsafeness, to be honest. And so I just want to address that, like, WTF is such a tokenized word, to be honest.
What's WTF?
Women trans femme, right? Women trans femme. Like, the cycling community loves to throw that word around all the time, like it's supposed to be this inclusive phrase. But yet, like I said, I've yet to be in its space, and I think kind of touching around like accessibility, right? And then like who are you really making the space, well, you know, welcoming for? And it's just like not leaning on those few friends, you know, but not only just talking about like demographics, you know, but talking about like childcare needs, right? And a lot of community grassroots organizations, like that's always like one of the things on our list, right? It's like we gotta have childcare. And we have to have food, right? People are gonna come over here, right? And they're working class people, poor people, mothers. We gotta have dinner. We gotta feed them. We gotta make this happen. You know, if it means we gotta do a potluck style or something, we're gonna feed our people, right? You know. And it's also translation. We live in such a diverse city. We should have translation always, you know. And I think going forward as a solution around WTF, I would say to honestly stray away from that phrase, and just maybe create something that's a lot more encompassing of marginalized folks, right? Because then it's like, what about folks that are triggered by femme or women, right? That are gender non-conforming, that are trans, that are, you know, just like the gender spectrum is so big, and so is like the spectrum on sexuality as well, you know. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Anyone else want to throw down on that one?
Our stuff has come up, but I don't know.
Please take the floor. Take the floor.
Let's see. Yeah, Jane, to your point, I was just in that like self-awareness piece, because I'm trying to understand, and I don't really want to position myself because in terms of the Women's March, right? I already put my position out there. See on my face. Culture, it's a cultural thing. But yeah, like just even in recognition of things like that. Like I was in, like I said, I live in Oakland, and I had my, you know, my reservations about it. I didn't participate last year. I didn't participate this year, and it was so funny because I was like walking. I was by Whole Foods. I was in Whole Foods actually, and and I was leaving, and I was debating like, should I go to this thing? And then I saw who was going, and I was like, you know, no, this is not for me. You know, we're speaking very candidly. It's like 7-something right now at night. But yeah, just like that self-awareness as we do when we movement build. If certain folks aren't there, that should raise flags for us, and question like why it is we're doing what we're doing, and just in terms of like, yeah, so I just throw that out there. I was like, that's a hot topic, let's just throw that into the mix, because I had feelings about that, and then it created a really uncomfortable and actually unsafe space for me at work when some of my colleagues who are white women brought it up, they were like, what was your favorite sign at the march? And I was like, I couldn't participate. And so in terms of that, like, where we think we're creating this safe space because we say certain buzzwords and we're participating in these these marches or in a part of these movements, but when certain people aren't saying anything, it should just tell us something about the work that we're doing. So I just wanted, that came up as we were talking. That's relevant right now.
And so to like follow on to that, so when well-meaning cycling friends or racing partners or people you commute with ask you to explain like why intersectional feminism matters or why you don't like pink pussy hats or how they can claim to not be political but they just like biking, like how do y'all respond to that? And that's like open, anyone can take that, but like how do we deal with that when someone says, oh, I'm not political, I just like to bike, and you're like, man, the bike is political. Like, I don't know. Any times. I mean, I've had friends come to me and be like, what's wrong with the pussy hat? Like, why don't you like that?
I'll start us off, and hopefully other folks want to join in. It doesn't really necessarily touch on the hats, but more so just about like space and public space and how being on a bike or deciding to get out of a car for certain people is a very vulnerable. You're putting yourself in a very vulnerable position, and even just thinking about like bike lanes as a buffer zone and how certain people need different types of buffer zones. So for me, sometimes I feel like my car is my buffer zone. I still drive because I live pretty far out and I need my car for a number of things. I have family out here, so just kind of recognizing that like everybody experiences the street very different, and there's a lot of environmental design aspects to it. There's also some social things that happen on the streets as well. So just kind of recognizing that like public space is very contested and it's highly politicized, and we just don't walk around like there's something to be said, like to be able to have that freedom to say I can get on a bike, and the only thing that I need to protect me is a helmet. Really, that's big, that's huge. So I don't know if that really gets at your question, but just in terms of like taking things for granted, like yeah. So I'll stop there.
I can jump in. So I think the thing that I say to people like that a lot is that, as you already mentioned, like it's inherently political riding a bike. Like that's a statement in our society. It's not something a lot of people do. It's not something a lot of people feel comfortable doing for a number of reasons. Just getting out there and doing it, you are. If you're saying I'm not political, that probably says a lot more about the position you are coming from as a person in terms of your actions. And trying to have, I don't always want to have those conversations with people. Sometimes it's not worth it. Sometimes it's just like, sure, like you don't understand why you don't see more people biking out here. Well, A, maybe you're not biking in the right part of the city to see a more diverse group of people. Because when I work at a tech company, full disclosure, I see a lot of other white people biking to and from work, right? That's the crowd I see on 8th Street. That's who's out there, and if that's your only experience biking, those are the only people you're going to see. That's all you're going to think. Yeah. You're going to be like, oh, I just see everybody else with their tech backpack going to their tech job, and they're just getting to work, but like not realizing the realities of it, the difficulties, the fact that it's not a safe decision. We frame it frequently when we're doing bike advocacy in it not being a safe decision from perspective of being hit. But that's really only one component. Yeah. That's a much bigger decision for many other people. For a long time, I was uncomfortable biking to work because I wasn't necessarily sure how good the facilities were to change at work. And that wasn't a conversation I felt comfortable starting. I eventually got over that and had that conversation, but someone who says it's not political just goes to the shower and takes a shower and cleans up and goes to the desk and never has to think about those kinds of questions. I would say it's just helping them realize, and if it's not worth it, then moving on. I don't like to really discard people, but like there's some people who are like, oh no, this is normal. It's like this.
I mean, that's such a hard decision, right? Like when to identify that you're either going to try and engage with this person in this sort of heated, very personal conversation, or just walk away. And like, how do you make that decision of like when to engage and really get into your elbows about what this means to you and be passionate, right? And when to just say like, no, I'm not going to do this with you. Does anyone want to step to that?
Kind of obvious answer is, am I at work? Because then I'm not going to engage in that conversation because I need my job. Let's just be real about it. And then, do I have the time and energy to engage in this? I mean, like, it's funny because even just saying like that bikes, they are political, but to some people they're more of a tool.
Yeah.
Like especially people that have been riding forever and they're marginalized. A lot of displaced people, I do not at 100% do not promote bike theft, but it's more common because it's not seen as something that's that valuable, it's something that's easily replaceable, and it's more transportation than anything else because it's difficult. But even then, like, before I even got into bikes, I used to have a frustrating time with it because people would be like, stop driving. I'm like, some people are not physically capable of biking, and not taking that into consideration too. Like, that's a serious barrier. And so, I think that there should be, more easier transportation to get around. It shouldn't always be, just cars or just bikes. But it is funny because it is like, it's political in that it isn't to some people and that it is to people that don't think that it is. And, and then, the fact that some people aren't taken into consideration that they've been riding their whole lives too. But I mean, like, I've definitely had some conversations, loud conversations with people that, maybe could have been a little modified when it did, I think it really depends on what happened. Somebody, even a bicyclist just like do something or it's kind of ridiculous and you're like, I feel the need to correct people. Sometimes, but it's like, but it's still, it's depending on your energy. Like, I'm trying not to, be too rude to people, but like, I am a pretty blunt person. And so, if somebody's asking me, I'm going to give them a direct answer. But once again, if I have the time and the energy to engage in that conversation, and a lot of places, if it's work or work-related, I'm not going to. I'm just going to be quiet because it's really, I've had some times where it feels okay to get in and try to help somebody understand, but sometimes you can just see their statement is like right there, and it's just not worth it.
Yeah.
I kind of want to add that biking can also be a privilege, right? Not only as people that are able-bodied enough to be biking, but also as far as economically, right? And also like, where are these routes more accessible, right? When we look at like low-income neighborhoods, like, am I really gonna trek all the way from the Excelsior to downtown, right? When there's not really good like bike lanes versus I have the privilege to be in the outer Sunset and I can bike all the way to work over by Civic Center, but I'm not running into a diverse commute, as I'm biking over here, And so instead of maybe engaging in those heated conversations, I think that's why Visas del Pueblo does what we do, right? It's like not only acknowledging that biking can be a privilege to some folks, but acknowledging that in our community, it's a form of resiliency, right? And that's why we do our bi-monthly bike bills, so that people have access to biking, right? That they can come and do the Earn a Bike workshops, right? So they can come and build their bikes and they engage in community. It's something that I love about Visas del Pueblo. It's not like a standard, there's a lot of different spaces for Earn a Bikes, but it's not like a standard, come in, put your time in, that's it, get your bike, you're out, right? It's like, no, you're here, we're building community together, we're getting to know each other, we're like family, we are intergenerational, family, we're accessible to languages, we're working out, Tagalog a little bit too, not just Spanish. And so that's really where it comes back to, right? It's like, okay, where am I really going to put this energy, right? I'm going to put this energy in the community, right? And working with the folks that need it most, right? And doing these bi-monthly bike bills so that they get comfortable, right, on taking up that public space, right? Going back to what Brittany's saying, like, it's not always a safe space for us, right? And so it's like, not only getting them the bike, but the skills, right? The skills to get ready on the road as well, right? So they can take up that space that is also rightfully theirs.
And so when you look at biking as like a necessity for some folks and a privilege and the tool versus the toy conversation, and then we look into the context of like group rides and racing and all of that. So I'm curious, Jen, what you have to say on going on group rides and when you find yourself, and we are in San Francisco, right? We are in the Bay Area. There are a lot of very expensive things to be had in the biking world, especially when you're doing it as an activity and as a toy. And so, how do you respond to people, or what advice would you give for other women of color who suffer like these like weird slights when like folks look at their gear and it's like regular, right? And it's not the most expensive multi-$1,000 bike. Like, how do you deal with that? And like, what advice do you have for other like young girls who are trying to get into bike racing and like bike riding, right? Because it's fun. If we have the privilege to do it for fun, it's awesome. But like, people are there making us feel bad for our stuff. Like, how do we do it?
I think there are all too many ways of making us feel bad for doing stuff. I remember when I first started racing, I had no idea what I was doing. I felt like I was the only one with not noisy hubs, which indicate that they're fancier. And I was not as skinny as everyone else. I'm also super insecure about that and hyper aware of it, especially in bike racing, which even just a few years ago was way more dominated by white women. And so I think for me, I didn't have the fanciest gear. I was also worried because I didn't have full health insurance, so I was also worried about potentially getting injured during a race, which I was just doing for fun. So I just kind of leaned on letting my legs doing the talking and trying not so hard to think about what kind of gear I had, because when you're just getting into riding or racing, it doesn't matter if you buy a $20,000 bike if it's your first time getting on it. And one of the things that I always struggle to work on that I think is really important is that when you first get into something, you're most likely going to suck at it, and it's going to take a while to get better. And I think it's important to find community, and I think that's a lot of the reason why we're here, why all these wonderful organizations exist, is because if you see other people like you who have similar backgrounds or upbringings or struggles, you don't feel so alone. And even if you were, I would just encourage still getting out there, because at the end of the day, this is for you to improve on, and that's what it should be about.
So I had my first bike race last year. I did Mission Crit, which Katie was also the announcer, and I've been biking for the past 5 years, but it was always like a necessity, right, for transportation. I didn't do it recreationally because I'm like, oh, that's not for me, really, right? It was hard enough just getting on my bike anyways, right? Trying to like navigate the dangerous road and be like, wait, now you want me to go faster?
Yeah.
And so it was like, I didn't see myself in that community, right? And it was really like surrounding myself by other people that looked like me, which I didn't find a lot, right? That encouraged me to get on my bike. And they were like, no, you have like a talent, you should get out there and start racing, But at this race, right, it's in the mission, and La Misión and Mission Crit, from what I know, I was the only Chicana racing in this race. You have 22 women registered, and I'm the only Chicana right now in La Misión that's racing this right now? What does that say? Right? That it's not completely accessible, right? And so then how am I supposed to really feel comfortable with doing these training rides when I'm like, I don't see myself out there? So how should I believe in myself that I can get out there and race you know, and do the Tour de France one day, you know. And so that's why we started Nothing Nice too. All right, some of our Nothing Nice folks. Is to really create that space so that other women in QTPOC can go on rides, you know, and can start to find like that camaraderie, you know, because it's difficult when I'm surrounded and all I see is no one really that looks like me, you know, and I'm sitting there with like gente that are mission rooted, right? That I was like at this race and I was really blessed to have like, let me just tell everyone here, I'm not from the Bay Area, I'm from Riverside, right? But I'm very much blessed to be connected to La Misión, to be connected to the people that were born and raised here, to be connected to people that are indigenous to this land. And so I was blessed at that race to have an indigenous blessing, but we're like over here hiding on the corner of a building, doing an indigenous blessing. You know what I mean? And I'm like, over here, we're doing our indigenous blessing, and we're getting looked at like we don't belong there. You know? And so it's like, it's more than just like the gear or like getting out of your shell. It's like, no, we gotta make these spaces for each other, right? So that we can encourage other folks, other QTPOC and other women of color to be like, no, you know what? This ain't just for them, it's for us too, right? You have a hashtag, right? Or you have a phrase, we wrench too, right? I don't know if you want to catch a person.
So when we have these spaces too, these specific QTPOC spaces, and we've done a lot of work, right, to build them up, to find our people, and to make it special and feel safe, and we have the representation, and then we have very well-meaning folks who are not QTPOC who want to come in and participate or support or join or just even be in the space. How do you respond to that, and what advice maybe, I'm looking at you, Binky, because I'm interested in what you have to say, like what advice would you have for other QTPOC organizers out there when that happens? Like, how does that work?
I feel like it really depends on what exactly your angle is, and you're never probably going to get it 100% right, but I mean, I am in the vein of feeling like, I mean, you know, I do teaching mechanics, and it's specifically, I mean, I do it for other organizations, and but I try to specifically do it for people of color, women, and trans, non-binary folk, because those are my things too, and because that I did not see that, and I walk into bike shops and it's male dominated, white male dominated, and you know, and so trying to, you really have to create that space and just kind of hold on to it. And so some of the things that, you know, like you can either have an event and just be, and I've put notes even on my website that just say like, if there were to be like an open, you know, workshop and it's primarily for these people, but we're not excluding anybody because of the reasons of being white passing, you might not be white, I don't want to ask you at the door, you know, you might, you know, like depending, I'm not going to try to judge people and be like, are you this, are you that, you know, but just so that, but to be like, let's say you are like a cis white person and you want to join, like just be aware, is there a whole bunch of you already in the room? Maybe you come back to the next one. You know, it's something to just be kind of like aware of, but I feel like, you know, that's how I would hold some of mine, but it really is an individual. And honestly, I think that if people want to have closed, like just for them, that is their right, because, you know, nothing else is space. Public spaces are not really public. They're, you know, they're not safe spaces for all kinds of reasons, you know. I'm sure everybody's been harassed in some kind of ridiculous way, probably even in this room, just walking down the street. And so, like, even recognizing that I would not be able to go into everybody's little corner, you know, but the right to have that and to then build those things, and then, you know, you get the group together that doesn't, and it's true, because, like, you might go to this thing, but nobody is doing exactly how you're doing it. And recognizing that, you know, you're there to race, not to do exactly all the same customs as everybody. Everybody's got different customs. That's kind of a little off topic. But yeah, just, I think just, you know, it's really individual. Things are going to be wrong. You know, you're going to get, you know, somebody's going to be angry at you because they can't join. And you're just kind of going to have to be like, well, you can join anything else. You're fine. Okay? You'll be fine.
Anyone else want to jump in there? So when people do that, when they like claim, you know, reverse racism, or they get pissed because your space is exclusive, like how do you respond, and what advice would you give to other people on how to respond? And then it kind of tied back in with what I was saying earlier, like it takes so much energy to respond to that or to even receive that. Like, how do we deal? You know, like, what advice would you give to other folks on like how to deal with that? Because it comes up all the time. Like, you know, your women-only space is sexist. Your POC-only space is reverse racist. Like, all this bullshit. You know.
I might not respond directly to the question because I'm also like just in turn. I know you're the moderator.
It's cool.
But I'm really just like sitting back and like listening to all you lovely women up here and like, yeah, y'all are so awesome and brilliant. And resiliency is really awesome too. And I really want to shed a light on that. Like, and just to hear that there are like women of color who are racing. I've never heard of that or experienced that. So just wanted to kind of like honor that we're doing all this really cool work related to transportation and mobility. And so I just wanted to say that because I don't know, I just wanted to put that out there. I'm just feeling really good and really energized. And that question was like, well, just like, it was kind of like bringing me down just a little bit because I have been in this thing where like I grew up in the Bay Area and I went to a private school in San Rafael. So at the age of 14, I was educating white folks about some of their shit, some of their baggage. And so I just learned quite at a very young age that like I needed to preserve myself. And I learned about self-care and creating spaces. And so this is a space up here too, and just like kind of building spaces with people that I identify with. And I don't necessarily have to do like a lot of explaining and even recognize or justify a term like reverse racism, because I'm like, I know we're way past that too. So I just kind of wanted to honor that like we are so, we're already there. Like this panel is kind of reflective of the work, the transportation work and the mobility work that needs to happen. And just hear the question around like inclusivity and getting into spaces. I think there's also this piece where like things that we already do, cultural practices that, for instance, I'll speak very specifically about Oakland, right? And like the lake and how the lake when I was growing up was like pretty bad. Like it was smelly. Nobody wanted to be near the lake. We did have festival at the lake. Like that used to pop when it was like an event for a community to come out. And so it was in the 90s. And I remember I have like a picture and there's like footage, but it was like back in the day, it was dancers, music, barbecue, all this like awesome stuff. And it was the only time people really want to come to the lake because otherwise it's just smelly and there's nothing really going on. So I guess what I'm trying to say is like, there are things that we already have built in and they are being policed. Thinking about gentrification and displacement and all these things that we've kind of like held on. Like we've held Oakland, we've held the Bay Area, we've held the mission in our arms. Like we've been resilient and we've allowed it to thrive. And now people are kind of basically just saying like, whoa, you don't necessarily, we're gonna fix this up and we're going to make all these improvements and we're going to basically just kind of like, just shit on all of your cultural practices. And when I think about the lake and how it is easier to bike and it is easier to walk around there, it's actually quite beautiful. And it's a really beautiful gathering space. You see all these people who are forced out of Oakland coming back and gathering, but things like barbecues are policed, things like loud music policed. And so I just kind of wanted to like bring that into the conversation too. Things that we've held in public space. That doesn't necessarily we don't need to infiltrate. Like it's already ours. Mm-hmm. It gets attacked in the name of transportation and in the name of walkability. We are policing people's cultural practices. So that just came up, and I don't know if anybody wants to talk about that too.
I mean, that leads me to like another thought though, is like, so when you know a transit project is going to only serve wealthy, predominantly white users, but is being sold to the public as this multicultural elevator, right? How do you communicate to people that you're like, no, you're missing the mark? Like, you know, for other transportation planners or transit folks who are doing community organizing who are like, wait, what? You know? And like you or Jen or anyone else who has anything to say to that, please, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Some of the goals that we should have as it relates to transportation planning shouldn't just be about mobility. I think it should be about connecting communities, economic development, community development. So what are the things, what are those drivers, and how is that going to, how are the decisions that we are making going to connect people to jobs, connect people to their neighbors, connect people to food, to health, all that good stuff. Those are some of the things that I think about as a transportation planner, and that I think gives us a leg up. So we're not making those same mistakes and planning for one group of people, because thinking about a bike, if I think about somebody who lives by the lake and has the privilege of just being on a bike, that really constrains my thinking. I have a car because I am from here. I have a ton of family and my life changes on a day-to-day. And I need to be able to pick up my sister. I have a nephew. I have relatives that I visit and they live in Antioch and Discovery Bay. So just even recognizing that like everybody has different ways of getting around because not everybody's the same. So that's kind of how I think I have a connection to the community. My family's been here for 3-4 generations. So those are some of the things that I take into account when I'm planning. And it's very difficult to communicate those things if you don't have that experience. So I think representation is important, and representation in leadership is very critical. Yeah.
And so on the like representation and like leadership sort of tip, I want to speak to like white passing privilege and light skin privilege, and I'm wondering if Jane or Jen, if you want to speak to leveraging or using this sort of space that you get to exist in, and if you don't exist in that space, correct me and tell me to walk it back. But like, what advice do you have for other people with that privilege on how to best leverage it? Right, and not be like, I can't think of the word, but how to best leverage that.
I think the best way to leverage it is this is true outside of things besides biking and transportation. It's really trying to recenter that, you know. Sometimes I have valuable things to say because of my experience, but sometimes I don't have the right things to say, and if I don't, then I should just be like, oh, then you should really check out this person, go read this, go watch this. It's going to explain it 10 times better than me. I'm not going to just do half the justice to someone else's lived experience because I can't. I have no idea what it's like to be a person of color. Like, that's not my experience. Why am I going to try and speak for that? When there are plenty of people you're just not maybe listening to, you haven't found, you haven't connected with. They're there. Especially, I mean, for all of the drawbacks of much of social media sometimes, one of the most powerful things really is, you can go connect with really powerful voices on things like Twitter that are speaking from totally different perspectives, that are giving you this opportunity to learn. You can just watch, you can see what they say, you can read what they write, and really just trying to connect people to those, whatever that issue might be. Certainly when I'm talking about trans issues, like centering some of that around the fact that it's like I'm a white trans woman. I've experienced certainly negative experience because of that. But like when we're talking about violence, that's trans women of color. When we're talking about lack of opportunity, that's trans women of color. And like there are so many great people that you can go reach out to and learn from. Right? Go read some Janet Mock and then come back, and then we can have more of a conversation about something. Like I'm still not your best resource though. It's still not my lived experience. It's just trying to remind people, like, I can't be there to answer that, and really you need to try and find it and learn from it. That's the best thing I can do.
So that sort of dovetails with this question that we got from the audience, and it's to the entire panel, so anyone feel free to respond to this. But someone asked, how can white men best be allies to women of color?
Just go check other white men. You know, curation. You know, yeah, because it's really, you know, I think going back a little bit to what Jane was saying, right? Like, you can't necessarily speak on our experience, right? What you can do is speak on your privilege, right? Because some people, they're not going to hear from us sometimes. They're like, no. But they'll hear it from a man, especially a white man, right? And so it's really, it can be really, you know, triggering, and it's just really traumatizing, right? When we're constantly being continuously drained for our labor, our unpaid labor, you know, especially as like, you know, femme folks, QT, POC folks, like trans folks. And so it's like, I think we need to stop asking that question, you know. It's like, I think it's just like, you need to just, you know, and I'm all about like community dialogue and everything, but at the same time, like, you know, we have to work on our self-care too, right? We've constantly, especially like as femme folks of color, we've constantly given so much energy of taking care of everyone else except for ourselves, right? So I would say, yeah, just go talk to other white men about checking, you know, their male privilege, checking their white privilege, checking any homophobia, transphobia they might have, you know? And money. You can always give us your money.
I want to kind of go on that. I mean, that's pretty accurate. I mean, I feel like it's true because like you can only do so much not being from that, and you have to give so much space. And a lot of times I say Google. Like, the internet is out there for you, okay? You don't even have to ask a person. Go Google whatever question it is, read all the literature, and then come back. Because it is true that, like, you get tired of being asked the questions, like, how is this experience? What do you think about this? And it's like, how was my day? Like, maybe I'm not in the mood to answer this question. And, you know, and so, like, doing the work yourself is a really big part of it. I think, you know, like, fortunately, because of the internet and things like that, there are a lot of ways that you can find these answers. And and also taking into consideration that that's that person's answer. Look up more than one thing. Everybody, you know, I can't speak for all of blank people because I'm just me. You know, and so, you know, just making sure you check a lot of things. And then, I mean, I'm just going to add on the money tip. Like, if you have it, because in a lot of ways, like, there can't be, you know, you can't create a space and then keep it without enough people in there that are leaders representing that. And then how are you going to do that? If you have the ability to find, even if you just have the ability to donate $5 a month to an organization of your choice, that is helpful. You know, and just doing whatever you can, I think really is helpful.
Yeah, I think talking about, like, when we're talking about money and resources, right, it's something that our communities and marginalized communities definitely don't have enough of, right? So and I often ask myself, here I see, you know, a volunteer or a member that is, like, from the community, but they don't have an opportunity, right? They're not even given the opportunity, right, because of all the infrastructure, like the structural violence and just, like, privilege to get to the job. You know, that needs to, like, you know, in transportation, right? But that I'm, like, seeing really badass folks on the ground that are probably doing a better job than most people in positions of power, right? The people that are on the ground and are really building the community, right? So not only, it's like, when we're talking about money, we're talking about, like, resources and leadership positions, right? So, yeah.
And can you talk about, like, lifting those people up too, right? Like, how, because we know that women of color do that on the ground work, and they put so much labor in, oftentimes unpaid. Like, how do we lift them up and make sure their names get up there, like, along with, you know, transportation planner X who heads whatever design firm, right? Like, how do we do that? How do we make sure we get our people there?
I think it goes back to really investing in the community, right? Is how are you going to really intentionally build community with the community like partners, and then you're not just going to the staff of an organization, right? That you yourself are getting to know the people in the community as well, right? So that when you have an opening in your organization or in your company, you're like, wait a second, you know, I know that Alicia, or you know, same like run person, is such a committed member or volunteer and does this work. You know, they might not have, and they may though, you know, have access to higher education, or maybe not have that fancy Harvard or whatever. You know, maybe it's just City College, maybe it's just SFSU, but it's like really building that intentional community and investing in the community too, right? If there are trainings and workshops that you can offer so that we can get to more of an equitable place too.
Anyone else want to ask?
Yeah, I just want to echo that, just in terms of like, there is really nothing you cannot learn. And I think transportation planning, what I've noticed and why I was in grad school and I studied economic and community development because that's what I was attracted to and that's where I saw the work happening. And I kind of just strayed away from transportation planning. I was like, oh my gosh, this is so white, male dominated. I don't want to deal with this. But that's right now, if we're talking about opportunities, that's where all the opportunities are. And so I've started personally to build with other women of color in the Bay Area who work at SFMTA, who work at planning firms, and we're committed personally to investing in women of color to have those types of jobs. So that's one piece, and just even like recognizing that maybe your background might not be transportation, but it's public health, it's education. All those things you can learn, pretty much you can learn anything. And I guess the mentorship piece is really important too. Like, as a person with privilege, whatever your ethnicity, gender identity is, like if you are in a place that you can teach somebody something, that is really, really important and really key. I would say personally, the time that I felt the most empowered was when a woman of color who was an executive director, she offered me the job on the spot because her qualifications were simple. You have you went to grad school, and you grew up in the Bay Area, and I'm going to teach you everything else you need to learn for the job because there's nothing that you cannot learn. So those things where you have that moment to empower somebody, don't take it for granted, because that's really opened the doors for me. And imagine people who don't have that type of network, right? For all of the things, structural racism that you've identified. Like, imagine somebody who doesn't have that network of family and friends, and family friends who went to this school and are in this whatever. Imagine that person, then they're completely shut out of the job market, even if they did all of that, like got into debt to go to grad school, all of that stuff, just getting into that person who had that question about how you can help, give somebody a job who is not a transportation planner or whatever, just teach them something and expose them to opportunities and networking opportunities and all that good stuff.
Well, that's bringing us really close to time now. And so I want to ask one last question, and then we can close the night out. We're getting tight here. But this is an interesting question. What can be done to uncouple opposition to the Mission Street red lanes, which are the bus lanes? I think they're sort of like BRT, which serve transit riders, from the opposition to Mission neighborhood gentrification. Anyone want that one?
I think it goes back to just talking to the community. You know, I know people that are born and raised in La Mission, and they were like, what the, you know? So it's just like, it's not necessarily about like, oh my gosh, what do we do now to engage, try to get rid of the opposition or something like that. It's like, what you gotta do is what you should have been doing from the beginning. Talk to the community, right? And like I said, going back, don't just talk to people in positions of power, right? Go talk to the señora, go talk to the neighbors, right? Go stand at the market that everyone likes to go to, right? Do that on the ground, like relationship building.
Anybody else want to speak to that? I could, but I've been talking, so I want to give it to somebody else. All right then. I feel like we're getting pretty close, and I want to thank you all for coming. And I would like actually everyone to stand up and give an applause to our panelists who took time out of So thank you everyone for coming tonight. Thank you to our panelists for sharing and going deep and getting uncomfortable, and maybe it was whatever easy, I don't think so. But thanks everyone. So we're gonna start wrapping up the night. We are going to go to Odd Job. Look to Julia, who I think will be leading the caravan. We do have to leave here. We gotta be out by 8. Which is why we're doing a hard stop here. If you're interested in having more of these conversations, take them to the bar, take them to your neighbors, take them to your friends. Keep these conversations going because it gets better when we talk more. So thank you everyone. Have a really good night.